The House will come to order. All in the chamber and the galleries, please rise, and we will begin our work today with a prayer by Monsignor Kerwicki.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let us bow our heads and pray. O Lord our God, grant unto the members of this chamber and all who work with them and for them a fresh sense of your power as we take up the duties of this day. May we learn to think your thoughts and keep our hearts open to our people. Grant us the wisdom as we make decisions, goodwill as we relate to one another, and courage as we struggle to do what is right and good for all. Breathe upon us, O breath of God. Fill us with life anew, that we may love what you love and do what you would do. And the House says, Amen.
Thank you. You're welcome, sir. Please remain standing and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. You don't want me singing, trust me. I pledge allegiance. Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move for the approval of the House Journal for the fourth day, Tuesday, January 10th, 2023, and ask for a roll call vote. Hey,
the gentleman from Jackson has moved for the approval for the House Journal for the fourth day, Tuesday, January the 10th, 2023, and has asked for a roll call vote. All those in favor of approving the journal, please vote aye. We're going to roll call that. Please hit the green if you like it, no if you don't. Mr. Clerk, please ring the bell and open the board. Mr. Clerk, please close the board and tally the vote. By your vote of 154 yea and 0 nay, 4 present, you've approved the House Journal. Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next order of business is introduction of special guests.
Introduction of special guests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, introduction of special guests.
Please proceed.
Thank you. On my left and your right, between the second and third columns, I'd like to introduce Joe Rager, a constituent in my prior district, and now just over the line. And so again, being a state representative, I still consider him a constituent. Amazing gentleman, done wonderful things for the Lake of the Ozarks. First Title Insurance Company. He was responsible in large part for getting our community bridge taken care of, and mover and a shaker in Camden County and actually in the state of Missouri. We are so thankful to have him. He looks too young to have accomplished all the things that he's accomplished, and I'd just like the House to give him a warm welcome.
Welcome to the House, gentlemen. Lady from Camden, you're recognized again.
Thank you. Additional special guests, please.
Please proceed.
Thank you. And in the upper gallery, in the teal shirts, I'd like to introduce the class of Leadership Camden County and their director, Casey Cloak, from the Chamber of Commerce. Please stand. This is an amazing group of current and future leaders for Camden County. It's the largest class they've had, and they are here in the Capitol today, touring around, visiting, getting to know Jeff City and the lay of the land. Like I said, an enthusiastic, very impressive group of people, and I'd like the House to give them a warm welcome.
Welcome to the House. Further introductions. Gentleman from Cape.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To recognize special guests.
Please proceed.
Thank you. In the gallery above me and right behind me, I have 3 wonderful liberty-loving people visiting today. It's Kim Schwartz, Shelley Welker, and Linda Reitzel. I'd like for the House to make them feel welcome.
Further introductions. Gentleman from Polk.
Permission to speak with a microphone other than my own, sir.
Please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, as we know, the members of this body sometimes suffer under the illusion that they're we're the most important people around here, but we're reminded frequently that we're not. The people that operate around us, that keep this place moving, are really the people that keep us all grounded. Up above, Tony, you have to step forward, sir. Tony Riker's 80th birthday is today, and want to be sure to give him a warm welcome.
Happy birthday, gentlemen. Further introductions. Seeing none, gentleman from Jackson.
Mr. Speaker, I ask you to recognize the lady from St. Charles for a special guest.
Oh, lady from St. Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is to announce a special guest.
Please proceed.
Between the second and third column, we have today Kathy Conway. She's a former member of the body from St. Charles County, and she's done great things for our county. She's a friend and mentor to many, and many here today.
Welcome back, lady. Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next order of business is points of personal privilege, and I ask you to recognize the lady from St. Louis, District 83, for a point of personal privilege.
Lady from St. Louis County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As legislators, we are all family. We argue and fight and disagree, but in the end, we share a special bond. We are family. Early last Thursday morning, we lost a member of our extended family. As he was driving home from the inaugural ball, hours after he was sworn in for his third term, Connecticut State Representative Quentin Williams was killed by a wrong-way driver. He was just 39. I had the privilege of getting to know Q last year at the CSG Toll Fellows Leadership Program. His infectious smile brought joy to everyone. He was full of life and energy. Connecticut House Majority Leader Jason Rojas said, "Representative Williams was an amazing human being. His infectious smile could instantly make a difficult day better. He was an amazing husband, friend, and colleague. He loved community and serving others. Truly a friend to all who knew him. This is a terrible tragedy and a great loss to our state. My heart goes out to his wife, family, and all who loved Q. We will miss him." Mr. Speaker, I ask for a moment of silence for our fellow Representative Quentin Williams, with loving thoughts for his wife Carissa, his mother Queen, and for the Connecticut Legislature.
The body please rise and join me in a moment of silence for Connecticut Representative Williams. Thank you. Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next order of business is first reading of House bills.
Mr. Clerk, would you please read the first reading of House bills and House joint resolutions?
House Bill number 755, introduced by Schwadron, an act relating to introducing the death of dogs and cats with a penalty provision. Inducing. House Bill number 756, introduced by Morris, an act relating to handheld electronic wireless communication devices with penalty provisions. And House Bill number 757, introduced by Mayhew, to assistant physicians.
Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next order of business is House resolutions, and I ask to be recognized for a motion on House Committee Substitute for House Resolution 11.
Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move for the adoption of House Committee Substitute for House Resolution 11.
Gentleman from Jackson is moved for the adoption of House Committee Substitute to House Resolution 11.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the rules package that will govern the rules under which this body will function for the next 2 years. This came out last Wednesday, and so members have had a chance to review it. I do want to bring up some of the points that have changes. Probably the two things that matter most for members are the rules committees and the limitations on filing of bills. So members will be limited to 20 bills per session. This will only start in the next session. With your permission, with your leave, they could request more bills. The reason this was done is that our legislative drafting committee They are overworked. They have a lot of bills to write, and it's becoming the case where we're not able to get our legislation in a timely manner because they're so overworked. And so if we limit the number of bills, members will have to be more focused with their legislation, prioritize their legislation, and maybe help our legislative drafters out who do a great job. If they do need a bill for a constituent or an emergency, they can still request one with you. The other one is the rules committees. It is now 3 rules committees are formed. The committees that usually funneled up to a specific committee are now, it will be chosen by the speaker, and members will have the chance to lobby the rules chairs to get the bills into their committee. I actually think this is a very member-friendly measure, and it will make members have to collaborate with more members than they normally would, and I don't think that's ever a bad thing. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment to offer. It ends in .30H. It's been distributed. I move for its adoption.
Gentleman from Jackson has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 1. Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an amendment that has 3 parts. 1, it amends page 26, line 683. When the bill is in committee and has been execed out, it will have 15 days within receipt of the Speaker's office to then be referred to a Rules Committee. We add the words of receipt because the Speaker has to have possession of the bill. The second part of this amendment adds "and infrastructure" to the workforce and infrastructure. That's just a typo in the bill. And then the third part, it adds that subcommittees may have of Budget Committee may have members who are not on the big Budget Committee. So those are the 3 things. A very non-controversial amendment. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Further discussion on House Amendment 1 to House Committee Substitute to House Resolution 11. Gentleman from St. Louis.
To inquire the amendment maker.
Does the amendment maker yield?
I do.
Please proceed.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate some of these changes and clarifications. There's one in particular I wanted to ask you about without getting into all of the other rules, but specifically just on this amendment, the approps change. Can you tell me about that again?
The approach change of the House Committee Substitute or just this one?
Of your amendment.
So this just clarifies that subcommittees have members, but those members don't necessarily have to be on the big Budget Committee.
Okay. Is that a subcommittee? Or is that just another committee then?
Well, I think at that point it's a matter of semantics, but in the past it has been a fact where you can be on the budget subcommittee, but not necessarily the big Budget Committee, and make recommendations to the big Budget Committee.
So my understanding is that as long as they've been subcommittees, they've been only members of the budget, and that it was back in the day when they were separate committees that they were able to have different members. But now you're saying that there'll be subcommittees still, but they won't actually be subcommittees because they'll be different members?
Well, there'll be members that aren't on the Budget Committee as a whole.
Right.
Functionally speaking, they'll make recommendations to the big Budget Committee, and then the Budget Committee will act on those.
Well, they won't make recommendations, right? I mean, they'll actually amend the bill, right?
Amend the bill, make recommendations, send it up to the big Budget Committee, and then they will take action on the bill.
Okay. I apologize. I'm not trying to be hostile to this idea of there being other members, but it does raise a lot of concerns. Have you been talking with appropriate staff about how this process will work, or with leadership, about the rest of leadership, about how the process of budget will work if you have different members on the different committees? Like how hearings will work? Do you know yet how the hearings on budget bills will be held?
No, I haven't talked specifically about that issue, but I think it's an issue that the Budget Committee and the members can work out. I don't see anything in this amendment that would bar them or hinder them from doing their jobs. I don't think necessarily it's a terrible idea that people that aren't on the budget as a whole have a say in part of the budget.
Agreed.
And people that aren't on the Budget Committee do have a bit more time to focus on maybe that specific subcommittee.
Yeah,
so I don't think that's a bad thing either.
I actually completely agree. I think there's a lot of value in that. My concern is more functionally about how the presentations from staff and from the departments will work, and making sure that everybody on budget and everybody that's on a specific approps committee are all in the same room for those presentations of the budget requests by the departments. Do you know if that's the intention?
I don't know what the necessary intention of this aspect was, but functionally, members are on different committees, so I don't think it'll change whether you're on Gen Laws or the subcommittee. You still be able to go to the hearings, but you may not if you have another committee, just as you would if you had another conflicting committee. So I don't see how functionally this would change. No one can be in two places at once, so functionally I'm not sure this will affect much.
Yeah, I guess I hope you're right, but I have no assurance of that. And since we're going back to what looks more like a system that existed before my time here, that I've heard some concerns about procedurally, I would really appreciate some assurance before voting for this change here. And you just don't really know the answer to that right now.
Well, I think the assurance is that we have over 30 committees. We have found a way for budget members to serve on budget and other committees. I'm very confident that they'll be able to serve on this subcommittee and serve the budget committee as a whole.
Okay, thank you. One second, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, may I inquire of the gentleman from the past budget chair district, Smith? I'm sorry, I forgot the county. 163
The gentleman
Jasper.
from Jasper yield to the gentleman from St. Louis City.
I do.
Please proceed.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Good morning.
You're probably more familiar with this than anyone in this room. So I'm curious what your take is on this change of approach, and specifically if you happen to know the procedural answer to the question I was asking, if you heard it.
Yeah, I did hear it. I think I'm understanding. I'll try to rephrase it for you.
Thanks. You might say it better than me.
Well, I don't know if that's the case. Maybe I should ask you to restate it. But
We'll see.
I think what you're asking is, how does this affect the process, and what will the changes be? How will we make sure that each member that is involved with the budget process receives the ample time to hear from, talk to the departments, and go through the process?
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, this is a process that is similar to what we've had in the past, so there is a blueprint that would enable that to happen. Functionally, I mean, you know, and we spent enough time in that committee to know that if we make a change like this, we will need to address some things that are a little bit different. Amongst those things would be the subcommittees hearing from the departments, or the bigger budget committee hearing from the departments. And theoretically, we could get into a situation where we don't have enough room for all these people to be in the room at the same time. So we're going to have to take extra measures to make sure that there's ample time for each member of the subcommittees and the big budget committee to thoroughly vet these requests and go through the process. And that will take a different structure. And so that's what I'll say about that. I believe it's completely feasible.
But you don't know what that different structure is.
I think it's probably looks much like it was before. And so
Before our time here?
yes. But it's relatively easy to understand. The value, and again, the value here is, as you've mentioned before, is that more people are involved in the process. There's a greater diffusion of the understanding and the importance of the budget, which I think is a great value here. And
specialization of some that can really focus and dig in. Yeah.
In exchange for that, it does change our process a little bit. Is it workable? Absolutely. I think does the value, pros outweigh the cons? My opinion is yes. And so we will we'll do what we need to do to work through the process and make sure that everyone has their role in this.
And also that we're not stretching staff into a new place that would be a problem for us either, right? My big concern is making sure that we're all hearing from the departments directly about their requests, and that there doesn't end up being a situation where only the appropriates committee hears from the departments their requests, and then budget does something else. You're pretty committed to that not being the case from your perspective, at least?
I believe that we can fashion a process with which that everyone feels comfortable with their availability, the department's availability to the respective committees.
Okay.
And so, I'm in support of these rule changes, and I believe it will add some value to the process. It'll look different, and change always feels odd at times.
There are things I'm excited about. I did not actually like the process we've had the last few years for appropriates. So I actually am, and I think I'm going to be happy with this. There are a couple pieces that make me nervous for the sake of process. But
sure, understood.
I want to make sure they're covered.
It's very important that everyone gets the chance to address the departments as they need to. It's also very important that we make sure that our staff is able to coordinate and serve the respective committees, and I think we can do that, and I'm excited about a new process.
Great. Appreciate the inquiry. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 1 to House Committee Substitute to House Resolution 11. Seeing none, gentleman from Jackson, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I renew my motion.
The gentleman from Jackson has renewed his motion for the adoption of House Amendment 1 to House Committee Substitute to House Resolution 11. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. And those opposed, no. And the ayes have it. You've adopted House Amendment 1 to House Resolution 11. Further discussion on House Committee Substitute to House Resolution 11. Lady from Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment ending in .04H. It has been distributed, and I move for its adoption.
The lady from Barton has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 2 to House Committee Substitute to House Resolution 11. Further discussion on House Amendment 2. Lady from Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, rules are created to help create a productive and respectful atmosphere. The same is true with our House rules, which also gives each of us the game plan so we can make the most of our time, which allows us to be as effective as possible. House rules also encourages and preserves the formal decorum in the chamber of the Missouri House of Representatives, which allows us to conduct business efficiently and effectively. Decorum is more than just rules. It is respect for each other, respect for the institution, and respect for this magnificent building and for the position of Missouri State Representative signifies. Today, we're going to pass House rules that will guide each of us on how business is conducted in the House. It is essential to always maintain a formal and a professional atmosphere on the House floor. And to ensure this happens, I have felt compelled to offer this amendment, which cleans up some of the language in Rule 98 by mirroring the previous language in the Gentleman's Dress Code. And with that, Mr. Speaker, if there are no further questions, I renew my motion.
Further discussion on House Amendment 2. Lady from St. Louis.
To speak on the amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the lady's attempt to ensure that we are respecting this body, as we should. In the past 4 years I've been here, obviously some of those rules, especially for us ladies, have been skirted, and rules are rules. However, I do have concerns that some of us lack the fashion acumen, if you will, to make such decisions on what we can and cannot wear. We are a place of laws, and words do matter. For example, this is a place where we ought to be dressed in business formal, which does call for women to have our arms covered. I think we're being quite pedantic here by making rules so petty, and what it will ultimately lead to is the disenfranchisement of folks. For example, they don't make jackets or blazers for women who are pregnant. That could be very uncomfortable, particularly in a pro-life state. I'm not here to spend anyone's money. If we're talking business formal, as the lady is suggesting, it is inappropriate to wear sequins in velveteen before 5 o'clock p.m. And yet we do that. That's not in house rules. With that being said, I would like to inquire of the lady from Platt, please. Thank you.
Sorry, lady. I didn't recognize you there. Does the lady from Platt yield to the inquiry?
I do.
Please proceed.
Hi, lady. So I see and again appreciate, because I certainly agree with the lady in that this is not just a place for us to come kick around and come as we see fit. You do that on Tuesdays in August, April, and November. Here is a place of formality. It is an absolute privilege to be here. We are a reflection of about 40,000 other people, and we should certainly put the seriousness of purpose when we come here. On that, me and the lady certainly agree. With that said, if we are going to be so specific on language, I want to dig deep a little bit, not even deep. Do you know the difference between a jacket, blazer, cardigan, and African?
Not specifically, but my understanding is that a blazer, the definition of a blazer includes a lapel, of which Not all cardigans do. I'm looking at a beautiful blue cardigan over there. I do not see a lapel, but it is a second layer. It does appear to be business formal. It does appear to be appropriate for this building.
Let me apologize to the body. It is appropriate for me to have my button buttoned while I'm standing, which would require this blazer, which it is, with the lapel, to be buttoned. I like to wear bishop sleeves, beautiful thick sleeves. I like to look fashionable, my boots. And so, but I also want to be appropriate. I'm not here, again, to spend anyone's money or give them a day or two to have to buy another wardrobe because an individual felt like putting something in house rules. Because, do you see a problem with the way that it was written previously?
I don't, and I actually don't know how this language changes too much, because my understanding is that this rule is going to be interpreted about like the last rule was. Is that right?
Sure. I think we may have some enforcement issues. I don't think that covering, to the lady's point, should be us just wrapping something around ourselves and having our arms exposed. I do agree with the lady wholeheartedly on that. That is, in my opinion, inappropriate. It's not something I would wear to, a normal job. This setting is business formal. It's not wedding formal. It's business formal. We are not men. We've made that clear in Missouri. And so with that being said, us trying to mirror men's clothing would kind of be contrary to conservative values, wouldn't you think?
My understanding is that conservatives prefer women to be women.
Yeah,
and that involves, I'm guessing, dresses and skirts and pregnancy.
Yeah, it doesn't get much more formal than going into the Lord's house. Would you wear a cardigan to church?
You're asking the wrong person, Representative.
Oh, well, thank you, lady. Mr. Speaker, I love the Lord. He heard my cry. I'm a Pentecostal. I wear cardigans to church. I'd like to inquire of the lady from St. Louis County, Pfeiffer District, if I can, please.
Does the lady from St. Louis County yield?
Yes, I do.
Please proceed.
Hi, lady. You have on a very pretty blue button-down cardigan. I served as a school counselor. That looks like something I would wear to work that would be considered business formal, which this setting is. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And in fact, if I could make a comment,
please, ma'am.
In my prior profession as a pastor of a church for 41 years, I would wear this on a Sunday morning. Now, in my tradition, it's interesting. We would wear robes so that, I suppose tradition. But it kept people warm and it kept comments from happening. Because I do want to point out that in my 41 years as a pastor, what business formal was changed.
Absolutely.
When I started in the 1970s, I would never have worn slacks. Oh, no. Sunday morning, it would have been a huge sin to wear slacks in church. Some of you remember those days. And I continued to wear dresses on Sundays. I finally started wearing slacks during the week. And one Sunday I was at church and I realized every single older woman in the sanctuary was wearing slacks. And then I gave myself permission to change my dress code. The point is, dress codes change. They are not immutable characteristics. I don't even understand what a blazer means or why we're having this conversation. I have things that I think are blazers, but as I was listening to the definition, I realized they don't have a lapel. Mm-hmm. And I am a little concerned for the people who are tasked with keeping decorum. Are we going to have the lapel police?
I just want us to be able to vote. I don't disagree with the lady, and by no means am I trying to throw volleys and take shots. I don't want the doorman to be walking around while we're engaging in important debate, trying to figure out whether or not something is a blazer, or while someone is in the middle of talking, being able to speak on behalf of their district, someone thinks it's funny to go get a doorman or to point of order them in the middle of speaking because they may not understand the difference between a blazer, an Afghan, a jacket, or something else. This is not what the taxpayer is paying for us to do. I did speak with the lady, which your cardigan, because it has buttons, would be banned under this rule. I think that's ridiculous because just like you, on August 2nd and November 8th won your election. And instead of focusing on what kind of top you have on, I ought to be concerned with this legislation so I can represent the 40,000 like they represent their 40,000. Now, if you come in here with a tank top, I'm gonna tell on you.
Right. I also have one more question.
Please.
And this is a very serious question to me. I get very cold in here. I am one of the people who does wear a shawl. I'm happy to wear it over something else. But are we at a situation where I'm not allowed to wear a shawl unless there's something else underneath it, but I can wear a shawl even if it's not seen, if I have a lapel underneath it, which is sort of straining at gnats, it seems to me.
For sure. So as I understand it, so long as you had because she said knit blazer, and it says knit blazer or jacket, and to be clear, a cardigan is neither of those things. There are definitions for these things that's neither of those things, so that means that the interpretation of this or the enforcement of this can be so subjective that we are keeping women from being able to vote. I frankly, if I wear a cardigan, with all respect to the House, I cannot, without a fight, y'all have to call the police on me, because those 40,000 people back in my district, and the Constitution, though the Constitution gives us the right to make our own rules, it does not say that our rules can inhibit our right, our constitutional duty to vote on this floor. I want to talk briefly, Mr. Speaker, thank you, lady, to the freshmen, if I may, to continue to speak on this. I want you all to pay particular attention, because there's going to be times on this floor where there are things that should not require debate and comment. I contend that these are one of these things. There are times to have your name said, to be recognized, to be called upon. This is not one of those things. There are some very serious things that are in this rule package that I think we should be debating, but instead we are fighting, again, for a women's right to choose something, and this time is how she covers herself, and the interpretation of someone who has no background in fashion, because again, and this isn't a shot, it's inappropriate to wear sequins before 5 o'clock, telling me that I can't wear a crispy good St. John sweater if it has too many buttons. I spent $1,200 on a suit and I can't wear it in the people's house because someone who doesn't have the range tells me that it's inappropriate. That's not why any of us were elected, Mr. Speaker. None of us. I urge us to vote no on this, because it's ridiculous. And also, congratulations, I'll keep that to myself, to any of us who may be with child. You surely don't have enough or have the money off the salary that we make to go buy a bunch of new clothes or tailored clothes. And I hope that you're able to continue to wear your cardigan and vote on behalf of the people who sent you here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 2. Lady from right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To speak in support of the amendment.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to thank the lady for bringing the amendment forward. I couldn't help but consider, as I was sitting in my new seat that happens to be my grandfather's seat that he served in his last term in the 80s, Mr. Speaker. And I sit there listening to the debate today, Mr. Speaker, over this issue. Yes, there's been many lively opinions. Yes, there's been many voices heard. That's the point of this body, Mr. Speaker. But I was reminded of the fact that I looked through my grandpa's pictures the other day, Mr. Speaker. The same decorum then prevails now, and it's very important, Mr. Speaker, because it's about more than any one of us or any one of our opinions. It's about the legacy that we leave by following the rules and the structure of a house that existed before we were all born, and Lord willing will exist after we were born. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to go on and say that, as I've mentioned to some of the colleagues here this week in regards to the ladies' amendment, when I got my first job at Ace Hardware, I was hired by an individual alongside many female colleagues and many male colleagues, Mr. Speaker. They had rules. They expected them to be followed because decorum is important. We were expected to police ourselves and make sure that we respected the structure of the body that I was a part of at that moment. And now, Mr. Speaker, that same girl who worked at Ace Hardware gets to stand on the House of Representatives floor. The same thing that my boss told me then, I believe applies now. It just happens that we have a different boss, Mr. Speaker, and that's the people. The people need us to get to work. The people need us to vote yes on decorum, yes on respecting who we represent, because we don't represent any, it's so much bigger than us, Mr. Speaker. It's time to move on, vote yes on the amendment, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion. Lady from Jackson. Not Platt, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To inquire of the amendment maker.
Does the lady from St. Louis County yield? Sorry, lady from Barton. Do you yield?
Yes, I do.
Please proceed.
Good morning, lady.
Good morning.
So I'm curious about why you felt so strongly about this, considering the upper chamber does not have this restriction, and they seem to be able to do the people's business just fine with decorum. Why are we different?
Well, one, we're not the Senate. Two,
Right.
This has always been a House rule. And if we're going to have a House rule, we need to abide by that House rule.
Lady, do you think that every single law we make in this building, we should be making the laws based on the laws that are already in place? We've been doing it this way all along, so we should continue doing it and maybe restrict it further?
So there's a difference between what you're talking about and what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is adding to the decorum, which is vital in this building.
I've seen a lot of lack of decorum in this room in my 2 years here, and not once has that lack of decorum spurred from someone's blazer or lack thereof. I've seen a lot of fireworks. I've seen some people calling our speaker some names. She was dressed appropriately, but I did not see decorum there. There are a lot of ways we could break decorum in this room, but a woman, what she's wearing, that is ridiculous. I have personally been called into question offline about what I was wearing, even though I was following rules. But it was some gentleman in this room who decided that they wanted to question what I was wearing. You know what it feels like to have a bunch of men in this room looking at your top, trying to decide whether it's appropriate or not? Are we going to have Dana be checking our tags for whether it's a knit blend or a polyester blend or does silk count? I mean, this is ridiculous.
Lady, you're right. It is ridiculous. It is absolutely
So why are you doing it?
That we even have to talk about it on the House floor.
I agree. So why did you bring it up?
Why should we talk about something like this? It is absolutely ridiculous. You
brought this to the floor, lady. You tell me.
You would think that all you would have to do is say, dress professionally, and women could handle it. You would think elected officials could handle that.
You would think, but
No.
we're walking around here in sequins and velveteen, to the lady's point. So what is appropriate, and why do you get to decide?
We need to get over the sequence. That's ridiculous. All right, so men are required to wear a jacket, a shirt, and a tie. Correct? And if they walked in here without a tie, they would get gavelled down in a heartbeat.
Should we be required to wear ties, lady?
If they walked in without a jacket,
because
they would get gavelled down in a heartbeat. So we are so interested in being equal.
So then why didn't you write a rule that we should wear ties too? If you want to be equal.
Let's go for it.
Equal playing ground. Let's all wear men's suits in this room, lady.
All I am doing in the language is mirroring the gentleman's language. That is it.
It's not. What is it mirroring? Which gentleman?
So in the dress code, Rule 98, and this is not something that's brand new. At all times, when the House is seated, proper attire for gentlemen shall be business attire, including coat, tie, dress trousers, dress shoes, or boots. Proper attire for women. Now, The current one that's in the 101st book has a whole bunch of ors. So the reason why we wanted to clarify the rule, because it's always, when you're going to freshman orientation, you are told a jacket is required on the house floor. But there were some people interpreting this, if you were wearing a skirt or a sweater, you did not have to wear a jacket. So in my cleanup language, proper attire for women shall be business attire, which is the same thing that the men has, including jackets worn, the exact same thing. And then our list of clothes that everybody wears.
But not a tie.
But not a tie.
Understood. Okay, so the lady who was speaking earlier from St. Louis County, she was wearing what I would describe as a cardigan. Is that in line with your amendment?
There's nothing in here that says you cannot wear a cardigan. The whole idea of this is to wear something over your clothes that opens up in the front. That's the whole,
That's fair, but I've seen people wear a sleeveless second layer and be called out for not being able to. So is that second layer required to have long sleeves? Is that what?
Say professional dress, professional attire. That's what you look at whenever that's what I think of whenever I think of a professional
So your
attire.
interpretation of professional dress should be all of our interpretation of professional dress. Understood.
It's
Thank you,
going
Mr.
to be
Speaker.
interpreted.
Further discussion on House Amendment 2. Lady from Jefferson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To speak on the amendment.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to support this amendment. I believe we are all professionals here, and we should look like professionals. The jacket looks very nice on women. The men have to wear jackets with ties. I wouldn't suggest that women would have to wear a tie, but if it comes down to that and someone wants to put up an amendment for that, let's vote on it. I want to support the lady from Barton because she is in the right place. This is a professional place to work. We are here being professionals for all of our constituents, and we need to look that. Thank you.
Further discussion. Gentleman from St. Louis County Meredith District.
St. Louis City, Mr.
City,
Speaker.
sorry.
Thank you. To speak on the amendment.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, first of all, I'm not going to dare to say what is appropriate and not appropriate for women to wear. Which is also why I won't be voting on this amendment. If it were roll called, I would be putting a present. Because I don't think I'm qualified to say what's appropriate or not appropriate for women, and I think that's a really dangerous road for us all to go down. We've heard a lot about decorum, and it's important to respect this place. But I see people during that debate holding up a sign saying PQ. Is that decorum? We hear people treat each other with disrespect all the time. I'm sure I've been guilty of it more than once. The last thing I'm concerned about are the detailed elements of women's clothes in here. Personally, I'd say we shouldn't really have a dress code at all. I think it's up to my constituents whether I'm acting professional in here. They are who I work for. They are who should have a problem if they have a problem with me not being professional enough. And if I'm a cowboy and want to come in here with cowboy boots and jeans on, I know a lot of men wear cowboy boots in here. Is that professional? I don't honestly know or care. Khaki pants or a suit, which is more professional? I don't know. Our last two governors have on a regular basis been wearing a blazer and jeans with no tie. Seems like in this day and age, that's professional. This is ridiculous. Our people sent us here to pass laws, show respect to each other, debate openly and honestly about the things that impact them, not fight about mandates and rules on women's clothing. Y'all had a conniption fit the last 2 years when we talked about maybe wearing masks in a pandemic to keep each other safer. How dare the government tell you what you have to wear over your face? Well, I know some governments require women to wear things over their face, but here, oh, it's okay because we're just talking about how many layers they have to have over their shoulders. I'm so sick of it. And I wish we could just let this go and let people wear what makes them comfortable and professional and respectful. And let our constituents decide if that's not good enough. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 2. Lady from Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I inquire of the lady from Barton?
Please proceed as if the lady from Barton yields.
Yes, I do, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Lady, I know that we have talked about this, that we felt as if the language wasn't clear in the rules and that we were not trying to change the intention of the rules at all. But as time had gone on, we'd put or this, or this, or this, and then it became that people could interpret the rules differently. And all we're trying to do today is to take the same rules that we have and make them more clear.
Correct.
That was my understanding, and that's what we've worked on. We've talked a lot about what a knitted jacket is. We thought that everyone could understand what a knitted jacket was, that it's a cardigan. But I have an amendment that I'd like to offer with you, lady, on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to add an amendment to the amendment ending in point 48H.
The lady from Buchanan has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 1 to House Amendment 2. Lady from Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I really think the intention of the rule change today is just to clarify what we already have in rules. We don't want anyone to have to be the clothing police and to not have the clothing police. It's just really important that it is clear what's in the rules. And with that, I have an amendment that I'd like to add that adds the word cardigan. There was no intention to take away cardigans. We thought that knitted jacket included a cardigan, but we will have the amendment. If you look up the definition of a cardigan, it is a sweater in which is open in the front and your arms go through sleeves. That's all that we're asking. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I close.
Further discussion on House Amendment 1 to House Amendment 2. Lady from St. Louis County.
To speak in favor of the amendment.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the lady from Jackson? Buchanan. My apologies, lady. With the lady from Buchanan. Again, I can't stress this enough. I wholeheartedly agree with the lady in making sure that we are adhering to decorum. Without question, we can indicate sometimes where we may have gotten a little lax and loose, and so I certainly appreciate the lady's reverence for this body. I appreciate the lady for bringing this forward just to make sure that, to her point, we're not over policing or running our doorman and our clerk crazy, and we are really just trying to do what we're trying to do, and that's to make sure that we are respecting our constituents, our colleagues in this body. So I do support this amendment, and I hope everyone else does the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 2 to House Amendment 1. Seeing none. Lady from Buchanan, you recognize to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad this helped clear this up, and I close.
Lady from Buchanan has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 2, House Amendment 1 to House Amendment 2. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. And those opposed, no. And you've adopted House Amendment 2 to House Amendment 1 to House Amendment 2. Further discussion on House Amendment 2. Gentleman from St. Louis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To speak on the amendment.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I planned on debating about having a voice in this chamber, about how many bills we could file, about having amendments to amendments being restricted, about our time being restricted on the amount of time that we could speak. But sometimes I just feel compelled to speak, and this time it's because dress code brings up some emotions, because I've seen a lot of lack of decorum, like has been said in this chamber. I've seen folks stand up on desks to be recognized. I've seen not with my own eyes, but I've seen senior members of this chamber, each party, charge at each other and nearly come to blows. But they were all wearing suits and ties. I didn't get my first suit and tie until I was in college. An opportunity that not a lot of black people get. Because in part of laws that we pass in this chamber. So even saying that someone needs to wear a suit and tie in order to step on this floor before they get their first paycheck from the state of Missouri is shameful. Because I've watched a lot of documentaries, Mr. Speaker, about my history, about black history, about American history. And a lot of those folks that are hanging from trees were wearing suits and ties. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 2. Seeing none, Lady from Barton, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Professionalism is important, and these rules allow us to conduct our business, and that is exactly what we're going to do after we pass this rule package. We're going to conduct our business, and with that, I renew my motion.
The lady from Barton has renewed her motion for the adoption of House Amendment 2 to House Committee Substitute to House Resolution 11. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. And those opposed, no. And the ayes have it. You've adopted House Amendment 2 to House Committee Substitute to House Resolution 11. Further discussion. Gentleman from Boone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment ending in .43H that's been distributed. I move for its adoption.
Gentleman from Boone has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 3. Gentleman from Boone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment basically deals with a cap in the substitute language, limiting each member to 20 bills per member. I realize that it's rare that members are filing more than 20 bills. However, it ties our hands, and I really don't like the feel of that and the spirit of this body that we're capped at a certain number. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I think it could lead to some unintended consequences in that you're going to have more people filing a lot of amendments, additional amendments, because they're capped at the total number. So, again, we don't see a lot of that, but if we look at the big picture, I don't think it's appropriate to limit what we can do. I mean, we're representatives of the people, and we should have the freedom to voice our concerns and speak on their behalf.
Further discussion on House Amendment 3. Lady from Platte.
Jackson.
Sorry.
That's all right. Thank you.
West. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To inquire the amendment maker.
Does the amendment maker yield?
I do.
Please proceed.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for offering this amendment. I, as well, was concerned of the 20 restriction as well. Like many people in this body, we're here to represent our community. Year after year, maybe someone's district might be a little more needy than another. The bills I file are based on my community's needs, requests from constituents. Right now, well, I guess as of the end of the week, I'll be up to 17, which is quite a lot. And I know that we could have special permission to file more, but that's not a guarantee. So I would have to go home if I have other requests and tell my people, sorry, I've capped out. Your voice cannot be heard. So I just wanted to thank you and, just see if there's anything else you have to say.
Well, I think that's a good point you make about special sessions and whatnot, because different things come up. I mean, right now you may say we don't need that, but with COVID, for example, that brought a whole host of issues that rose to the forefront. So yeah, we don't know what's going to happen down the road. So why cap it? Keep it open just in case.
Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, to speak in support of the amendment.
Please proceed.
Everyone, members of this body, I encourage you, for the sake of democracy, for the sake of the people we represent back and home, to not silence their voice and vote in support of this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 3. Lady from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To inquire of the gentleman from the floor leader district.
Does the gentleman from Jackson yield?
Yes.
Please proceed.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you?
Morning.
Can you walk me through, again, for the edification of the body, why it felt necessary to limit the amount of bills that we file?
Well, the intent of this is to lighten the load on our drafters and to focus the legislation of our members. And if I may, I'd like to tell my good friend, the gentleman from the 46th, I had a lot of problems with this too, because when we limit what legislators can do. I finally got around to liking the amendment. Now, let me tell you why. In the past 6 years, only about 50 people have filed more than 20 bills. And when and I realize, especially in the minority party, you file legislation to sometimes make a statement, to tell people back home what you are fighting for. And I get that. And I recognize that. One of the things that I saw when I was looking at bills, and my good friend from St. Louis reminded us of this in committee, is that when a member files a bill, a lot of times the next year, they'll file the same bill, even though it didn't go anywhere, it didn't go to committee. But you file it because you want to let people know this is important to me, this is something I'm working on. So what I would say
it's not necessarily as prohibitive or additional work for drafting if we're there.
That probably
just
doesn't take as much work, but it is work, and it is still listed in your list of past bills.
Mm-hmm.
So you could say, if you want to see what's really important to me, go and look there.
But it's not about just what's important to you.
Right.
It's what you hope to become law. And so in order for it to become law, you have to file it, right?
You do, but there's nobody in here that's going to pass 20 bills, and that's why I finally came around to say,
I think a few people in here have passed 20 bills.
in one session that would be very hard.
Cody Smith, or I'm sorry, the gentleman from the Jasper has.
Indeed, and the gentleman is exempted from this rule for that reason. So what I tell you is,
Wait, is that
there are
that
ways.
in here?
It is.
Okay.
The appropriations are exempted
Okay.
for that reason. If you want to tell people back home what's important to you, I think a lot of us are good on social media. Post your bills there, and so that when you come back, file your new legislation. Also, I would remind the body this does not apply to this session. So my good friend, the lady from Jackson, can file as many bills as she likes.
So I want to follow up with the concern. So it sounds like perhaps the issue isn't necessarily being taxing to House research. It's more so about focusing on specific bills because, as was discussed in the committee hearing, it doesn't bar members from having hundreds of bills drafted. It just limits the amount that they file.
That's right. I did think that was a good point. I would hope that if you cannot file the bills, you would not tax the drafters and ask them to do that just for your own sake. There was another point brought up in committee where the gentleman from St. Louis said you could write legislation yourself. And if you have the ability to do that or you pay someone to do that separately, those are also things that you can post on your website.
Is there a requirement in our House rules that our bills go through House research, or can they be drafted by anyone else?
That's something that we could look at. But what I'm saying is the chances of you passing 20 bills is very low. And you should focus your efforts on the new things that you're trying to do. And again, I remind you, this is not for this session. And if you needed a bill for a constituent or something that's an emergency, you could go to the Speaker and make a request to the Speaker, a Speaker who we, 1 week ago, all elected by acclamation, that we have a lot of confidence in. So I came around to this because I think if you needed something for your constituents, that you would be able to do that if this rule goes into effect and next session.
Do you support the gentleman's amendment, sir?
Unfortunately, I do not support the gentleman from Boone's amendment. I support the rule that we have in the draft. I do understand the gentleman's concerns, and I hope I've tried to alleviate those as best I can.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 3. Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to inquire of the amendment maker, please. Or I'm sorry, the bill handler, please.
This is a gentleman from Jackson yield.
I do.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good morning.
Morning.
I want to kind of discuss some of the concerns that I have, just to kind of see what you think about this. So I think one of the things, with the idea being that it's going to burden House staff, I kind of think it doesn't, actually, because realistically, number one, it sounds like you said there was how many in the last how many years? You had a stat that I heard coming in. Approximately how many people in the last 6 years have filed more than 20?
50 if you don't count the appropriations bills.
Okay, all right. So, I mean, it doesn't really sound like it's really that big of a problem anyway. Would you kind of agree?
Well, now we're arguing if it's a big problem or not, whether we should have the rule or we shouldn't.
Sure.
What we're trying to do is get some way, because I think everybody in here has had this where you're trying to get something drafted and they're drafting other things. I do think this is somewhat member-friendly, because when you request something, you have a chance of getting it in a more timely manner. And again, on a bill that's important to you instead of one that you're doing because you've done it in the past and you have to file it again.
And see, actually, one of the reasons I think it's not so taxing on the House staff is because you can, I think if you go and you ask them and you say, hey, I'd like to offer an amendment to a bill, can you look at House Bill 576 and can you add that as an amendment? Then they're not having to do things on the fly. It's more or less copy and paste, and easier, I think, for them in situations such as that. Would you agree?
I think there's some merit to that argument, but again, if you're doing that and that bill hasn't been vetted, then we always ask, has this been heard in committee? So the chances of that passing are very low anyway. We're just trying to say, let's focus your energies, focus what you're trying to do. If you've had bills filed in the past, there's other ways to show people that those are the issues that you care about. If you need more bills, I'm confident that you can get more bills.
And I think, another concern I have is we're all term limited, right? We all have a certain amount of time. You never know what's going to take off either. I mean, you might be able to get something going, and at any given point, you don't know if you can maybe get that on as an amendment, working with somebody else, trying to get some legislation through. So I think I understand what you're trying to do, and I think that there's value in some of that, but also I just think those are kind of the concerns that I have, right? I mean, because if you're trying to get, just based on the fact that you don't know what's coming through, what you can offer, what amendments you can get on, and I think having those things already ready, because I'll be perfectly honest, I have actually filed more than 20 bills, and I don't always, but I think I do that as a way to kind of to have everything kind of already done, and it's already done, right? I mean, it shouldn't affect anymore. Everything I've already filed is already, and there might be something along the way, but I mean, I've already filed what I've filed, and it's not going to slow anybody down at this point. We also have a timeline, right? Like late February is when we can't file anymore.
Yeah, March or February.
Yeah.
I also want to remind you, if you have a bill that's really important to you and you don't mind not getting the credit, you can talk to another one of your colleagues and say, could you file this for me? For example, if you needed something for Jackson County that was good for Jackson County, I'd be happy to file it if I hadn't reached my 20 bills yet. It would be there. We'd work together. This would foster compromise. It would foster us working together. I really don't think this is going to be as bad as people might think it will be, especially since it doesn't even take place until next session.
Right. Well, again, I respect what you're trying to do. I have a differing opinion here, I think. So I guess we'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 3. Gentleman from St. Louis County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to inquire of the gentleman from the Floor Leader District.
This is a gentleman from Jackson yield.
I do.
Please proceed.
Hey, gentlemen. I'll try to keep this brief. So, you said that part of the intention was to have rank and file members to prioritize our bills, right?
Yes.
And in committee, I asked you, well, what do members get for prioritizing their bills, right? And what was your answer?
I think I said you don't get anything tangible, like a reward, but hopefully you would get it where if you requested legislation, you might get it faster. So, that would be something that's one of the intents of this.
Okay. And to long answer short, I hear nothing. I hear we get nothing for giving leadership a break and only filing 20 bills, because I didn't know how many folks filed more than 20 bills until you said it, and you said only 50 or so folks in the last few years?
In the last 6 years.
Okay. I'm one of those folks, so I feel a little bit slighted. However, looking at my bills, I filed 7 bills that deal with higher education. I can get those all squeezed into one bill and make them a higher education omnibus bill. Got a bunch of bills dealing with criminal justice reform. I can squeeze those together. So I could still get under my 20 bill limit if I needed to. Also, a big thing in my mind is the amendment bar, right? We took off the limits of amendments to amendments, so then we can just get a bunch of bills from prior years, or maybe bills that just pop into our head, like happened many a time, drafted by the amendment bar, rather than have drafters draft the bills when they're comfortable and can pull out a statute book or whatever they need, do a Google search, all the things that goes into good drafting, I would think, as opposed to having 40 folks running over to them at the same time asking for 40 different things. So I think that we're hurting potential legislation, like when we do things on the fly, like last year I vaguely remember a bill that was like Women in Sports Day, but it recognized for a whole month. So it was an error there, and I would think that if there were more eyes on it for a longer amount of time, then we would have been able to solve that. So what are we doing to solve for the potential of messy drafting?
Well, I think you bring up some good points there, but in terms of writing your bills, getting them, I think you discussed getting them referred. We still want the bills referred on their merits, but I can't disagree with you. There might be more amendments, but in terms of writing the bills, especially when in pre-filing session, that they'll be able to do that faster.
So I just kind of rambled off a bunch of reasons why this bill or why this amendment.
And I said you bring up some good points.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're not only good points, but they're reasons why we should just get rid of that rule altogether, because it's just a bad rule. Do you agree?
Well, for the reasons I stated earlier, I think we should have the rule, but I compliment you and think you bring up good points, but I do think that the points that we brought up earlier, I still stand by those, and I think we should pass the rule.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 3. Gentleman from St. Louis County.
Yes, to inquire of the amendment maker, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Boone, yield.
I do.
Please proceed.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you today?
Fantastic. How are you?
I'm pretty good. I was looking at the rules and the changes that we're looking at this upcoming session, and then I was thinking about your amendment, and I got a couple questions for you. So first off, what are you thinking with your amendment? What's your provocation?
You know, this is about freedom, right? And we hear in this chamber all the time, freedom, democracy. So why are we capping something like this? I mean, we're representatives of the people, right? We're the direct line from the people. So why are we imposing these limitations and forcing us to work around them? Why not just lift them? I mean, if it's rare that it happens, why do it?
Yeah, exactly. So my job is to represent 37,000 Missourians who have special needs, wants, a certain income level, racial makeup, religious beliefs, all sorts of things. And we've got to counter that with the other 5+ million folks that aren't in my district. And sometimes I need a lot of flexibility because, you know, those of us that care about decorum, care about the Constitution, care about how things actually are supposed to work, one of the things in our Constitution, which we kind of sidestep a number of times, before you got here, there was a gentleman that was a member of this body that made the constant point of order on just about every bill that we put together at the end of the year because it was not a single subject bill. And part of the process, and I know you're a process-oriented individual, but part of the process is to perfect the subject that we're working on. That's why we have several people sit in a committee with different views, different ideas, and perfect that subject. But in your experience, you've been here a little over 2 years now. Well, you're into your...
About a year and a half, yeah.
Yeah. So your experience, what happens at the end of the year?
Besides chaos?
and describe that chaos to me. What do the bills look like? So I've got a bill going through on unemployment, and what happens to that? How many pages does it wind up by the end of the year?
Well, and that's the issue. I mean, you have these massive bills, they become omnibus bills, and it's just a lot to get through.
So last year was one of the lowest years for passing legislation in the history of this body. Do you know how many we got out of here?
How many?
44. And I will say that I share the speaker's frustration probably and leadership's frustration in that we have thousands of pieces of legislation filed every year. And can you tell me when your pieces of legislation were, for the most part, referred to committee?
The last day.
The last day. So they were never heard in committee? You didn't get to go through the process? Your ideas actually weren't even considered?
Unless I put them on as an amendment and offered them. But other than that, no. Not as the original bill.
So I guess, gentlemen, one of the things that concerns me is not a cap on the limit of legislation that we file, because frankly, we need flexibility. We just went through a pandemic, and I know this body generated a whole bunch of legislation that we wouldn't regularly generate as a response to that pandemic. And we all have to have that flexibility as lawmakers. What we really need to address, in my opinion, and I'm curious what your thoughts on this are the process. And my voice, representing 37,000 Missourians, actually being heard in the process.
Absolutely.
So what's your take on that? Where is your idea for a fix?
Well, especially in this side of the aisle, we have to be very creative. And this just causes, it creates additional burdens and additional hurdles, because we may have to file more bills at the beginning, move them to amendments, and move in somewhat of different ways. So it really suppresses democracy, because all of us, we have the same number of constituents virtually. So it kind of tilts the scale against us in many ways, and it's fundamentally unfair, and can be for us especially.
Well, I appreciate you. I appreciate your amendment. Mr. Speaker, to speak briefly on the amendment.
Further discussion on House Amendment 3.
Mr. Speaker, to speak briefly on the amendment.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I understand the frustration of all of us with all of our constituents' wants and needs coming before you and begging to be assigned to a committee with our legislation. I get that we submit thousands of pieces, but I want to remind this body and you that democracy isn't pretty, it's not easy, it's frustrating. It's a matter of personal responsibility, what we choose to prioritize, and then we leave it to leadership that we elect with the belief that you're going to share our priorities at some point and help us move legislation through this body that's going to be good for all Missourians. And Mr. Speaker, I think tying our hands by a limit of the legislation, it just hurts the voice of Missourians. So I'm going to be voting against the bill. If this sticks, I'm going to support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 3. Seeing none, gentleman from Boone, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's err on the side of freedom. Let's err on the side of democracy and do the right thing. And I understand the sponsor has good arguments. They're not bad arguments. This isn't awful. But there's a fundamental principle that we all abide by. Everyone I talk to in this chamber, Democrat, Republican, this isn't a Democratic issue. I know it affects us in certain ways, but it affects everybody. Let's not have caps. Let's not suppress the views of our constituents. And let's err on the side of freedom and democracy. I renew my motion. Thank you.
The gentleman from Boone has renewed his motion for the adoption of House Amendment 3. All those in favor will indicate by saying aye. And those opposed, no. And the noes have it. You failed to adopt House Amendment 3. Further discussion on House Resolution number 11. Gentleman from St. Louis City.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To speak on the bill, resolution.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Okay, so this resolution has gotten a surprising amount of attention this year, as our House rules. And I know that probably a lot of people's eyes have already started glazing over talking about our House rules. and maybe we'll do so more and more as we continue today. But something really interesting happened with the rules this year, and that is, I think for the first time in my time here, and probably a whole lot longer than that, we had 600 people testify or submit testimony against these rules. Now, those of you who are new may not know if that's a lot. It's a lot. That's an unusual amount of participation in any bill, let alone our House rules. Now, part of that reason, of course, is that there's a spotlight in D.C. right now on a fight over how the House functions. And there are a lot of people suddenly realizing, hey, maybe our government that's supposed to be a representative democracy, a House of Representatives, shouldn't have all the power concentrated so severely in the hands of one or two people. I understand that that's probably not supposed to happen and doesn't happen very often in this chamber either, where there's noise from the gallery about one of these things. And you might even see some strange bedfellows in agreement on this topic. But the fact is, a lot of people on both sides of the aisle are realizing concentrating power isn't actually good for this process. Now, these rules changes that we're talking about today from our previous rules, I'll be honest with you, they don't make a terrible difference from our old rules. They don't. So the opposition to them, that what I'm finding is, when I talk to folks about their opposition to these rules, it's sparked by some of the changes here, but it's really about the underlying problems with our rules, concentrating all of that power in the hands of one or two people. And these rules, in fact, came forward with a couple of changes that concentrate that power even more and weaken the power of individual members and thereby the people each of us represents. So we only have certain powers in here. We just talked about one of them. It's filing bills. Our ability to file bills on behalf of the people we represent, put that on the official record of a bill we're trying to file. Now we're going to cap that? One of the few powers we have left that wasn't limited? It's already hard enough to get a bill referred to a committee because only one person gets to decide whether it goes to a committee at all, even though the Constitution requires referral to committee. Well, we've, year by year, session by session, further concentrated that power in the hands of a couple of people. The change to the Rules Committee that's happening in these, that's another one. Just a little tiny bit more power in the hands of one person. And I don't think people want that. Now, what I will say is, I don't mean to disparage our current speaker or floor leader. I'm actually more optimistic coming into this session than I typically am as a minority member of this House in the minority caucus. I'm more optimistic about them having an intention of running this place more fairly. The floor leader expressed in committee repeatedly his desire and intention to dramatically reduce the number of PQs and the abuse of the PQ we've seen in the past, which has increased dramatically over the last 20 years. You'll see, I'm not actually going to offer my PQ amendment to try and rein that in out of some good faith hope that he's going to follow through on that promise. But the fact is, we just keep going further and further with this. So, today you will see from my side of the aisle mostly, probably, hopefully a couple from the majority side of the aisle as well, some ideas of how we could improve these rules. Maybe not going a step further with a couple of these changes, but also maybe rolling back some of the changes that have happened over time and start to put the hands back more in each individual representative and thereby in the people. I hope you will entertain these and actually listen to them. And even if you don't pass them today, consider getting these changes in down the road. It's for the sake of all of us. Now, the problem with these rules is when I go talk to members across the room about these various rules, over and over again I'm getting agreement. Over and over again I hear, yeah, you're right about that, but I can't vote that way. Well, you can't vote that way because of the concentration of power in the rules, right? They hold themselves in place. And until the day comes where we have the courage to say, let's change the rules, it's just going to keep getting worse. Now, I do have one amendment I'd like to offer because I think it's the most significant change we could make in a policy outcome and where I'm the most familiar in this place. But I hope you'll listen to all the amendments that are presented and vote honestly on them. So, Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment ending in point 36H, and I move for its adoption.
The gentleman from St. Louis City has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 4. Further discussion?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to speak on it.
Please proceed.
Thank you. So, this amendment is probably the wonkiest one folks will hear today. And for folks that are new in the building, I apologize because you might not really know what we're talking about till you've seen it happen. But I'll do my best to explain it. I promise you'll understand it later in the year. This is about the budget and rules that are imposed on us in the House that are not imposed in the Senate. Specifically what's known as the balancing rule. Now, we talked a lot in committee about how rules have changed over time, and rules have been added to restrict and chip away year by year at each member's power. This is one of those rules. 20 years ago, this rule did not exist. It didn't exist, never had existed. We are under a constitutional obligation to offer a balanced budget. Don't misunderstand me, that will not change. This is about rules about each individual amendment that we offer in the budget process. 20 years ago, there was a decision made by leadership, let's make it so members on the floor who aren't on budget committee aren't able to offer an amendment if it increases the spending without offering an equal and opposite decrease. Don't worry, budget chair and budget committee could still do that. So they're concentrating the power a little more over the budget into the hands of the people fortunate enough to get appointed on the budget committee. Well, maybe 10 years later, the budget chair decided, let's actually concentrate this power even more just into the budget chair's hands. Now, the way this rule is enforced, once the budget chair sets a full amount of spending in a committee or in a chairman substitute, nobody else on our side of the building can spend beyond that number. Now that's despite there being a different number, the consensus revenue estimate, that the governor, the Senate, and the House have all agreed to. So what we saw happen last year is that we had a House that the budget chair, maybe for good reason, I'm not actually questioning the popularity or rightness of this opinion, limited our spending to $1 billion less, we'll say, it's a large number, than the consensus revenue estimate said we actually had to spend. Well, the result of this was members couldn't come in on our side and say, hey, but we have this money, here's a good place we could spend it. Even if it was a tax cut through the budget, whatever you guys wanted to do, you didn't have the ability to offer that. But the Senate did. And so what happened? Exactly what we said would happen. We sent over the budget and said, by the way, Senate, here's $1 billion. You could just spend however you want. And they did. Pet projects galore that happened the night before the budget was passed that gave us one day to decide we either have to accept their changes or maybe we don't meet the constitutional deadline to pass a budget. And so all of those things got in the budget. All of these projects and priorities of the Senate got put in, and we didn't even get to offer our alternatives. So all I ask is that we change this rule so that instead of being limited to what one person in this chamber says should be our max, we are limited by what the agreement between the governor's office, the Senate, and the House was. We have to stay within the balanced budget, which still the Senate doesn't actually have to do. We have to have a balanced budget. But we can discuss whether money should sit in the bottom line on reserves or be spent in various things like teacher pay raises or a different one-time tax cut type proposal, a tax refund, or whatever it might be that you want to spend those dollars on. You have that ability as an individual member to propose it, offer it, and debate it and get a vote on it. Senators can already do it. We should be able to do it too. If we want to decentralize power in this place, this is a good place to start. Happy to entertain debate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 4. Gentleman from McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to speak against the amendment.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I have just, I guess, one technical point, if you will, and then just make some general comments about it. And as the gentleman said, when we start talking about the budget, it generally does get somewhat technical and complicated, especially for those that maybe haven't served in this body before or don't have the opportunity or haven't had the opportunity to serve on budget. And I just want to read the amendment. This adds on to the back end of the balancing rule. And what is the balancing rule again? Just to make very clear, Mr. Speaker, if you have an amendment on the budget and it's an increase, we're going to spend money, you got to go find money first. You got to take that from somewhere else. You got to decrease before you can increase. That's all it is. And so this amendment says, except no decreasing amendment shall be necessary if the increasing amendment draws from general revenue look-alike, any reserve fund or similar fund or fund balance, so long as the result of such increase remains within the limit of the consensus revenue estimate. The gentleman talked about the consensus revenue estimate, what it is. But the technical point I would make is that there's no law that says we have to have a consensus revenue estimate. What if we don't have a consensus revenue estimate? Again, that's a process made up of the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. What if we don't agree? We don't always agree. Sometimes we don't agree. So then what do you do? What does this rule mean? How does it work? And I mean, that's a question I don't have an answer to. I don't think there is an answer really to it, or at least a good answer. And so I'm not sure we should bind ourselves to a rule based upon a process that might or might not ever happen, quite frankly. So further, what I would say, even though this purports to in some way amend the balancing rule, let's just be very honest about what this would do, and that is it effectively, as best as I can tell, and in my estimation, would for all intents and purposes eliminate the balancing rule. And so if that's what you would like to do, if that's what this body would like to do, then you should support the gentleman's amendment. But if we don't want to eliminate the balancing rule, which I would suggest that's not what we want to do, then you wouldn't want to support the balancing rule. I recall, as I talked about, coming in as a freshman member, serving on budget, and having some things, in the state, hearing about some things, some policy matters, some programs, and I thought, hey, this is really important to the state or to my district, my area, whatever. And it takes money. This is something we ought to do. But before I was able to do anything or even think about it, I had to go somewhere else in the budget and find that money. Make hard decisions. Had to cut something, some program that wasn't performing, that wasn't necessary. That's a good thing, in my estimation, that we would have to do that. That we would have to make, as a body, as members, that we would have to make hard decisions. They're very necessary. Now, it's interesting to me that this mentions that, hey, you can take from general revenue, you wouldn't have to decrease, but it even mentions a reserve fund. Well, isn't the definition of a reserve fund that we hold it in reserve? That we just don't have it there on any whim that we might, maybe we need some money for this. Well, let's go tap the reserve fund. Well, at that point, is it really a reserve fund? Mr. Speaker, I had a chance to speak at the swearing in of Missouri's 39th state auditor, former member of this body, Scott Fitzpatrick, former budget chairman. And I mentioned that day that Scott's one who doesn't just do things and do them well. He's one who'll stand firm on principle. And I didn't know we were going to have this conversation, but one of the things I mentioned, him standing up, standing firm, was he decided, the House decided, we ought to put money on the bottom line. We ought to not just look at the CRE and spend every penny, which is what we always did. He said, we need to put money on the bottom line. We need to put money aside. We need to save some money for a rainy day. Maybe revenue doesn't come in like we think it's going to. We need to put it aside. Fought the Senate on that. Fought others on that. But the House won. And that's become a customary practice. And let me tell you why that's really so important. If you appreciate the power of the General Assembly, the power to appropriate. You hear all about a balanced budget. It's a great thing. We got to have a balanced budget by the Constitution here in Missouri. They don't have that in D.C. We have it here in Missouri. It's true. We do have to have a balanced budget. But you know who that ultimately falls on? It's not this body. Let's just be honest about it. Practically, it's the second floor. It's the governor. Because we're budgeting for a year in advance. We're budgeting on estimates of revenue that's yet to come into the Treasury. What if we're wrong about that consensus revenue estimate? Oftentimes we are wrong. So let me tell you what happens when revenue doesn't come in like we think it's going to, and we spend every penny we thought we would have, but yet we don't have it. Guess what happens? The governor gets to make the decisions. And I'm a friend, I like this governor, but I like the power of the General Assembly to be able to appropriate even more. And it's not about who the governor is. Who should have the decision as to what the money's spent on, you or the governor? We shouldn't push that to him. But if the revenue doesn't come in, he doesn't have any choice. That's the executive. They're the one here. He has the power to withhold. And so then the governor, the executive, gets to decide where the money goes. And when the money doesn't come in, they withhold. We ought to make that decision, but we only make that decision when we spend less than we take in. And that's why this practice is so important. That's why the balancing rule is so important. And look, I understand there can be a temptation that maybe it seems like a good idea that we ought to be able to spend like drunken sailors or members of Congress. But it's not a good financial practice, first of all. It's not doing right by taxpayers. But more even than all of that, understand doing so, eliminating the balancing rule, supporting this amendment, takes power away from the General Assembly. And that's not something we should want or stand for, and therefore I'd ask the body not support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 4. Lady from St. Louis County.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To speak on the amendment.
Please proceed.
Thank you. The great Missouri Constitution gives this House the power of the budget. This House, everybody here right now, it gives us the power of the budget. We're not fully utilizing that power. If we want to watch our taxpayer dollars and we want to be accountable to our citizens, we're the ones that get to do that. I've been a small business owner. Nobody has ever charged me with taxing and spending anything. I used to squeeze dimes really tight. Now it's kind of quarters. But nobody spent less to manage a business. Well, maybe somebody, but man, I'm tight with my dollars, and I still am. I'm not going to willy-nilly spend dollars. Historically, over the last 4 to 6 years, we're giving the power of the budget over to the Senate. So the governor, and I like practical examples, so I'm going to try to create one. We're given $100 million to spend this year. Consensus revenue says we have $100 million to spend. Please, that's not a right number, but for practical purposes. $100 million. What we've done is put $10 million on the shelf and said we can't spend that. And nobody in this body gets to touch that $10 million because the chair has decided that should be in reserves. So we don't get to spend it. That sounds like a good way of spending money, right? Okay, there's a way on our website, Treasurer's website. Today, we have $16.3 billion sitting in the bank. It's not doing anything for the citizens of our state. In our great wisdom, we passed a great tax bill last year, so theoretically our revenue will go down, but Wayfair kicked in last week. So revenues might stay consistent. We're at 14% for the year. $16 billion in the bank, and we're only declaring $6 billion as surplus. So you get to figure out if we are doing right by our tax-paying citizens or not. I don't think there's anything close to fiscally conservative to have $16 billion in the bank. I don't think that's good fiscal policy in any measure. The balancing we're being demanded to do came about in 2002. It was a rule up here in the House only. It was never implied to be working in the committees, and it's only that new. So in the history of our nation, history of our state, 10% of our time we've had this balancing rule. So we're not asking to spend every penny. We're asking to spend the revenue that we have, that we expect to have. We have reserves. We have billions of dollars in reserve. We're not paying our teachers. Our mental health care isn't where it should be. Our health care for our citizens, our foster kids. The list goes on and on. So to be able to spend the money for this body, to take the power, to spend the money that we know is coming in, is what the Constitution says our job is. We should stop abandoning that to the Senate and letting the Senate spend it where they want to. We have the power. We should own it. I will support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 4. Gentleman from St. Louis.
County? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To briefly inquire of the amendment maker.
Does the amendment maker yield? Lady from...
I do.
Gentlemen, please proceed.
Thank you, gentlemen. Good day to you.
Good day.
How are you today?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm pretty good. We've talked about this subject offline a whole bunch over the years, and you've spent most of your time in the House of Representatives working on the budget, isn't that correct?
All 6 years I've been here, yep.
Wow. And I actually didn't ask to be on budget because I kind of knew what it looked like. And I'll tell you, I've written multi-million-dollar budgets in private industry before. I'm familiar with making hard decisions and making sure accounts are flush to pay the bills. And the way I always thought about this is just like my household budget, right? I have some idea what my paycheck's going to look like. Maybe I got a sick day or something like that. But I also have some idea what the cable bill is going to look like, what the electric bill is going to look like. And so when I'm making those decisions, I have this bundle of money and expectations of that money, right? So we have budget forecasts, we have revenue forecasts, we have all sorts of things. We just heard a lot of numbers being thrown out by the wonderful lady from St. Louis County, and her diligence is well recognized in this body. But what we're really looking at is when we get a budget, me, not on the budget committee, I'm actually not seeing the full picture, am I?
Well, that I guess is exactly what I'm getting to. And that's where the gentleman from McDonald, I don't think that was an accurate picture he just presented to everybody. I'm not sitting here arguing we should spend every penny. I'm not arguing we shouldn't have a reserve fund. I'm not arguing we shouldn't set money on the back end to save for the supplemental. I think that that's an absolutely healthy thing to do. I'm saying we in here should all get a say in that and in how much. Not just one person, especially because we know that the Senate doesn't care what that one person, whoever it may be in the future, says. And they're going to be tapping all that money if they want to. They're going to be deciding, was that amount of reserve fund correct?
But it's our constitutional responsibility.
It's our constitutional responsibility, but only one of 163 of us has any say at all over how much that reserve and bottom line is from the House's perspective. And then if any of the rest of us want to go beyond that, our only option to do so is to do it the way the Senate says.
So in real terms, we have priorities in this room that don't necessarily line up with the priorities across the hall.
Yes.
And, for example, last year we passed this fantastic senior services bill. They never got the money.
Not funded, I don't believe.
Wow. But we wanted to fund it, but there wasn't enough money set aside in our budget to do it, even though Missouri had the money.
Even though we had $1 billion
bill.
on the bottom line, and that's not even counting the 5 or 6 other that were in the bank at the time. Yeah.
Well, I get it. I understand. And I guess for me, when I'm talking about budgets, I think household budgets, and I look at teacher salaries, I look at mental health services, and I say our roof is leaking right now. And for some reason, we're refusing to pay to get it fixed.
Or we just have to go to the Senate to convince them to do it because we don't get to offer it here.
Well, I appreciate your amendment. I'm going to be supporting you all the way through. Thank you for the inquiry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 4. Seeing none, gentleman from St. Louis County, you recognize to close.
St. Louis City. I know, Mr. Speaker, you are partial to the county, but I've been a city resident my whole life. So, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, this is not overly complicated. I'm not removing the balancing rule. I'm changing what we're balancing to. I could have gone and just removed it entirely, which would have just meant we would go back to the way that it was 20 years ago, when a Democrat changed the rule. A Democrat put in these House rules. A Democrat put in the rule of the balancing rule because of a unique year, and they said, we got to be extra careful this year. But guess what? They were still balancing to the actual CRE because that's what the budget chair presented. That's what the budget committee, rather, presented. This is an unusual time. This is an unusual time. And here we are, tying our hands in the House in a way that nobody else has their hands tied. Because we want one person to solely make the decision of how much money we save on the bottom line. I don't think that's how we ought to do it. And I would ask the body to support the change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from St. Louis City has renewed his motion for the adoption of House Amendment 4. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. And all those opposed, no. And the noes have it. You failed to adopt House Amendment 4. Further discussion, gentleman from Clay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment ending in .22H. It has been distributed, and I move for its adoption.
Gentleman from Clay has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 5. Gentleman from Clay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment changes Rule 21, Subdivision 1, to allow the minority floor leader to appoint minority members to all regular standing, conference, and interim committees. The resolution as presented currently only allows the minority floor leader to appoint those members to regular standing committees, but can advise the Speaker on select conference and interim committees. This amendment standardizes the committee assignment process and gives the minority floor leader power to appoint all minority members.
Further discussion on House Amendment 5. Gentleman from Pulaski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To inquire the gentleman from Clay, please.
Does gentleman from Clay yield?
Yes.
Please proceed.
Gentlemen, I don't know if this is out of order, but I'll let you, to discuss it. I'm having a little trouble following your amendment here, but correct me where I'm wrong here, but I believe your amendment says by deleting the words regular standing and inserting in lieu of the words, and then we've bracketed and removed the words regular standing. Isn't there supposed to be something in that spot?
So I believe that my understanding, the intent is by removing regular standing, we are removing the condition, and so it's just including all committees.
But what I'm saying is the words themselves say, and inserting in lieu of the words blank. There's nothing in that spot.
Oh. Got it. Thank you. So on line 7, we are removing the bracketed striked language about the recommendations and instead substituting shall appoint, giving the minority leader the power to appoint the members.
So that's on lines 270 through 271.
Yes, sir.
And we're at line 243 unless I'm reading this wrong.
So the line 243, and perhaps the language is clumsy, but from my reading, we're removing regular standing. And the language would just state the minority leader has can appoint all members of committees as the language. All we're doing there is striking regular standing.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Further discussion on House Amendment 5. Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have confidence in our Speaker. In practice, the minority member does get to name many members. The Speaker concurs much of the time. I would recommend that we keep the confidence in our Speaker and that relationship that they have, and I urge the body to vote this down. Thank you.
Further discussion on House Amendment 5. Seeing none, gentleman from Clay, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just like to respond to the floor leader's point. I don't think this constitutes a lack of confidence in the Speaker, just that the minority floor leader may have a better understanding of which minority members may be the best to serve on this committee based on their expertise and experience and commitment to these issues. And with that, I renew my motion.
The gentleman from Clay has renewed his motion for the adoption of House Amendment 5. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. And those opposed, no. And the noes have it. You failed to adopt House Amendment 5. Further discussion. Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment ending in .10H. It has been distributed, and I move for its adoption.
The gentleman from Jackson has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 6. Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment changes Rule 27, Subdivision 2, to add that Missouri residents shall go first in testimony during a hearing. This amendment will ensure that we are hearing from our own citizens first before hearing the testimony of lobbyists or interests outside of the state. Further, this amendment shows respect to the private citizens taking time out from their lives and their schedules to speak to this body. I'll now take any questions. If there are none, I will close.
Further discussion on House Amendment 6. Seeing none, gentleman from Jackson, you're recognized to close.
Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
The gentleman from Jackson has renewed his motion for the adoption of House Amendment 6. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. And those opposed, no. And the noes have it. You failed to adopt House Amendment 6. Further discussion on House Committee Substitute House Resolution 11. Gentleman from Boone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment ending in .02H. It has been distributed, and I move for its adoption.
The gentleman from Boone has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 7. Further discussion, gentleman from Boone.
This amendment changes Rules 27 to require all committee hearings held within the Capitol building to be live streamed on the Internet if the locations of the hearings is equipped with the live streaming technology. This equipment would increase transparency of this body and allow for greater public participation in this process.
Further discussion on House Amendment 7. Seeing none, gentleman from Boone, you're recognized to close.
Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
Gentleman from Boone has renewed his motion for adoption of House Amendment 7. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. And those opposed, no. And the noes have it. You failed to adopt House Amendment 7. Further discussion on House Committee Substitute House Resolution 11. Lady from Platte.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment ending in .12H. It has been distributed, and I move for its adoption.
The lady from Platte has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 8. Lady from Platte.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment changes Rule 49 to remove the pre-distribution requirement for amendments and allows for amendments to be offered as a measure after a measure has been taken up for consideration on the floor. This amendment ensures that members can respond to debate on the floor and prepare and submit amendments as needed.
Further discussion.
I will take any questions. If there are none, I will close.
Further discussion on House Amendment 8. Seeing none, lady, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I renew my motion.
Lady from Platte has renewed her motion for the adoption of House Amendment 8. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. And those opposed, no. And the noes have it. You failed to adopt House Amendment 8. Further discussion on House Committee Substitute House Resolution 11. Gentleman from St. Louis City.
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment ending in .37H. It has been distributed, and I move for its adoption.
Gentleman from St. Louis City has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 9. Gentleman from St. Louis City.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. This amendment changes Rule 24, allowing 7 members to request a public hearing on any amended bill within a Rules Committee. This amendment will allow bills that have been substantially changed by the originating committee to allow the public to comment and express their concerns and suggestions on the amended bill. This increases transparency and public involvement in this body of work. I'll now take questions.
Further discussion on House Amendment 9. Seeing none, gentleman from St. Louis City, recognized to close.
Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
The gentleman from St. Louis City has renewed his motion for the adoption of House Amendment 9. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. And the noes have it. You failed to adopt House Amendment 9. Further discussion on House Committee Substitute House Resolution 11. Lady from St. Louis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to offer an amendment.
Lady from St. Louis has offered House Amendment 10. Lady from St. Louis.
Thank you. I have an amendment ending in .26H. It has been distributed, and I move for its adoption. This is very simple. It takes a may and makes it a shall. This addresses remote public testimony via telephone or video conferencing. This basically asks the question, are we held accountable to every single one of our constituents, or just the ones with the means to make it to this building? It is already listed that committees may accept this. This just enforces that we will not pick and choose to whom we are held accountable. It just allows for those who do not have the means or the wherewithal to get into this building that their voices are still heard. If anyone has a problem with this language, we can also move in the budget to make the building more accessible. The chief clerk has been sitting on plans to do so for over a decade. We just need to give her the dollars to do it. So I'm also open to that. Also, we could invest in the infrastructure of public transportation to make accessing the people's building a little bit easier for everybody. So I will now take any questions.
Further discussion on House Amendment 10. Seeing none, lady from St. Louis, you recognize to close.
Thank you. We are about to vote on whether or not we are accountable to all citizens and if all citizens' voices deserve to be heard. Thank you.
Lady from St. Louis City has renewed her motion for the adoption of House Amendment 10. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. And those opposed, no. And the noes have it. You failed to adopt House Amendment 10. Further discussion on House Committee Substitute House Resolution 11. Lady from Boone.
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment ending in .06H. It's been distributed, and I move for its adoption.
Lady from Boone has renewed her motion for the adoption of House Amendment 11. Lady from Boone.
This amendment changes the Rule 38 bill referral process so that all bills must be referred to a committee by the Speaker within 15 days of being first read. And if the Speaker has not referred the bill at the end of the 15 days, it would automatically be referred to a committee of the bill sponsor's choosing. This amendment ensures that all bills are timely referred to committees. I will take questions, but if there are none, I close.
Further discussion on House Amendment 11. Seeing none. Lady from Boone, you're recognized to close.
Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
The lady from Boone has renewed her motion for the adoption of House Amendment 11. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. And those opposed, no. No. And the noes have it. You failed to adopt House Amendment 11. Lady from Caldwell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment ending in .41H and has been distributed, and I move for its adoption.
The lady from Caldwell has offered House Amendment 12. Lady from Caldwell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My amendment adds a majority floor leader's consent for when the Speaker is deciding to dissolve or discharge representatives off of any conference, interim, or special standing committee. I will take questions, but if no one has any questions, I renew my motion.
Gentleman from Jackson.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate this sentiment from the lady from Caldwell. However, I do not think it's the right thing to do. This would inject another person into this process. I don't think it would have any substantive effect on whether members are kept on committees or off. As I've discussed with the lady, if a speaker wanted someone off a committee, they could just keep them on and form another committee and send bills to that committee. Functionally, I don't think this would do anything. Like I said before, I have confidence in our speaker. I think the rules should stay in place, and I would ask that the body vote it down.
Further discussion on House Amendment 12. Gentleman from St. Louis City.
To speak in support.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the lady presenting this change. I believe she's a freshman, but clearly has been paying attention to how things work around here. Because we have seen a number of times where a bill is about to be voted on. We saw this happen last year. A bill was about to be voted on in committee, and at the very last minute, the members got changed. Specifically removing members from committee, though, a committee that they have been on and have been a voting member on, is particularly offensive when they're likely getting removed because they don't support a speaker's agenda. Now, I don't know if this speaker is going to do that. He may or may not. And frankly, from a minority caucus member's perspective, it probably doesn't help us much. I'd love if it had the minority leader as well had to sign off on it. But simply adding a second person from the majority caucus, who you've put trust in as a leader, to say they at least need to both agree on taking this person off a committee, doesn't seem like a lot to ask, and it's a pretty small step, but good step, toward decentralizing power from one person. For that reason, I'd be supporting it, and I would sure hope that the rest of the body would too. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion. Gentleman from St. Charles.
To inquire of the amendment maker, please.
Please proceed. Oh, does the amendment maker yield? Lady from Caldwell.
Yes.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So we talked about this a little bit this morning. This is an interesting idea that I don't think we've heard here on this floor before, and I got to be honest, I'm not sure how I feel about it. I do agree with the gentleman from the floor leader district that adding additional people into what is usually an extraordinary process could muddy up the waters. I have a little concern that sometimes these things happen rather rapidly for a specific reason, and if someone wasn't available or if there maybe was disagreement, that would maybe cause some problems. On the other hand, theoretically, most of the time, our leadership are kind of on the same page about things, and this is not something that happens regularly. So I think this is an interesting idea to explore. However, I will say this, and we talked about this a little bit earlier. I do think there was one issue with how this is drafted that perhaps would maybe prohibit us from actually applying it today, and that's that you only have this limitation on the special committees and the transient committees, which are by their nature supposed to be temporary. That's the reason we have special committees set up in the rules as opposed to standing committees. And so I guess my concern is if we want to have this discussion, which I'm certainly open to that concept, we really, in order to make it effective, would really need to have it apply to the standing committees as well. Otherwise, quite frankly, I'm not sure that this really would apply in practice, except for in the circumstances in which we'd want to dissolve the special committee because it's a special committee. It was just set up for a limited use. Can you respond to that, or maybe give me your thoughts as to kind of where you're at on this and maybe where you'd like to see this discussion move forward?
Yes, I do agree. I think, it should at some point get involved with standing committees, but I think this is a good step in that direction.
Okay, so you're just kind of wanting to start the body moving towards the idea of maybe having leadership collaborate more on the official side of things within the rules, as opposed to, clearly they're doing that now anyway as part of our normal day-to-day operations, but you'd just like to see that codified. Is that kind of what I'm getting?
Yes, absolutely.
Gotcha. Okay. I like that thought. I'm not sure that today's maybe the way or the time to do it, but I do like that you brought this up, and great discussion. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Further discussion on House Amendment 12. Seeing none, Lady from Caldwell, you're recognized to close.
If no other questions, I renew my motion.
The lady from Caldwell has renewed her motion for the adoption of House Amendment 12. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. And all those opposed, no. And the noes have it. You failed to adopt House Amendment 12. Gentleman from Boone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have an amendment ending in .18H. It has been distributed, and I move for its adoption.
The gentleman from Boone has moved for the adoption of House Amendment 13. Gentleman from Boone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment changes Rule 29 to prohibit committees from taking executive action on a bill on the same day as a public hearing prior to March 1st. This amendment ensures committee members have time to consider public testimony and prepare amendments or substitutes to reflect the concerns or suggestions of the public prior to voting on the underlying bill. I will now take questions. If there are none, I close.
Further discussion on House Amendment 13. Seeing none, gentleman from Boone, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I renew my motion.
The gentleman from Boone has renewed his motion for the adoption of House Amendment 13. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. And all those opposed will signify no. And the noes have it. You've failed to adopt House Amendment 13. Further discussion on House Committee Substitute to House Resolution 11 as amended. Seeing none, gentleman from Jackson, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the robust debate, and I renew my motion.
The gentleman from Jackson has renewed his motion for the adoption of House Committee Substitute to House Resolution 11 as amended. All those in favor will vote yes. All those opposed will vote no. Mr. Clerk, please ring the bell and open the board. Mr. Clerk, please close the board and tally the vote. By your vote of 105 yea, 51 nay, and 2 present, you have approved House Amendment 11, House Resolution 11. Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next order of business is announcements.
Announcements. Lady from Green.
To make an announcement, Mr. Speaker.
Please proceed.
Today is National Human Trafficking Awareness Day, and many of us are wearing blue. We will meet in the front for a picture after session is complete.
Thank you, lady. Lady from St. Louis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The women legislators of Missouri are going to meet as soon as we adjourn on the side chamber over here for a quick meeting. Thank you.
Further announcements. Gentleman from Jackson.
Announcement, Mr. Speaker. For those that wore a bow tie today, we'll meet in the front after the blue take theirs if you want to take a picture. Thank you.
Thank you. Lady from Jackson.
St. Louis County.
I'm sorry. Other side of the state.
If we are to have peace on earth, our loyalties must become economical rather than sectional. Our loyalties must transcend our race, our tribe, or our class, and our nations. And this means we must develop a world perspective. Those were the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his final Christmas sermon. Tonight at 6:30 in the Capitol Rotunda, the Missouri Legislative Black Caucus will host our Martin Luther King celebration. No matter your race, tribe, or class, we encourage you to join us in celebrating the life and the purpose of a man who remains a moral example for our great nation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, lady. Further announcements. Seeing none. Gentleman from Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With no other business before the body, I ask that the House stand adjourned until 9 a.m. Thursday, January 12, 2023, for a technical session, and then stand adjourned until 4 p.m. Tuesday, January 7, 2023, for a regular session.
The gentleman from Jackson has moved that the House stand adjourned until 9 a.m. Thursday, January the 12th, 2023, for a technical session, and then stand adjourned until 4 p.m. Tuesday, January the 17th, 2023. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. And those opposed, no. And the ayes have it. The House is adjourned.